Would you please pray with me? Oh God, send your Spirit to meet us here, now, in this place or wherever we are. Bring us comfort and strength and peace and nourishment. For we long to keep going. We long to continue to follow you. Oh God, pour out your Spirit on us, that wherever we are, we may know that you are here with us on this journey. I pray, oh God, that my words would be faithful to you, and that all of our hearts would be open to receive the nourishment you are offering us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So in 2001, a never-before-seen drawing that was thought to have been done by the great artist Vincent van Gogh was discovered in a private collection. The unidentified owner of this drawing approached the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which verified that the sketch was, in fact, authentic. This drawing of an elderly farmer, seated in a simple chair, bent over with his face in his hands, was drawn by Van Gogh early in his career, during a time when he arduously employed himself to the study of drawing. During this time, Van Gogh was traveling throughout the Dutch countryside with paper and pencil and drawing people in villages doing their daily chores. This was a stage in Van Gogh's life when he was committed to realism. And each subject is depicted in this natural, realistic form without the addition of anything that would distract us from the subject or deter us away from the blunt force of real life depicted in these drawings. The final drawing that was based on this sketch, discovered in 2001, was entitled by Van Gogh, "Worn Out." It was one of many studies that Van Gogh drew using the elderly residents of the Dutch Reformed almshouse for men and women in The Hague as his models. These impoverished elderly people would pose for Van Gogh in exchange for a small payment. This retired farmer was named Adrianus Jacobus Zeeland, and he served as a model for Van Gogh for several of his drawings from this time period. It is thought that Van Gogh drew him at least 40 times. Perhaps Van Gogh was drawn to these ordinary people, to their labor and their lives, to art that showed their humanity and their grief, because Van Gogh, too, was suffering. Although his art today is some of the most famous and valuable in the world, in his lifetime, Vincent van Gogh sold one painting. And we now know that Van Gogh suffered from bipolar disorder, which on the one hand gave him the ability to create beautiful art, but also crippled him with a debilitating depression, and ultimately led him to take his own life. Van Gogh was able to depict the expression of human experience and depression so accurately in his art because he too knew what it was like to live with this illness. As we have been exploring through this season of Lent and talking about various stages of grief, the shapes that our grief can take, today we are going to spend some time talking about the difficult subject of depression. Depression is difficult to talk about because it is not fully understood, because it has been terribly stigmatized, and because it causes so much suffering to both the people afflicted with it and those who love them. And it's important for us to acknowledge in the church that we have sometimes done more harm, piling additional shame onto people who have depression, telling suffering people that they just need to have stronger faith. But we're starting to do better, to have more understanding and greater compassion and better support for people with mental illness. As my friend and colleague, the Reverend Heber Brown says, no one should feel ashamed to have both Jesus and a therapist. Today, psychologists believe that there are between 6 and 9 different types of depression, from very serious conditions, including clinical depression and bipolar disorder or psychotic depression, and then there are other kinds of depression, including kinds that can be brought on by life circumstances and stress. Seasonal depression, postpartum depression, or situational depression, which can be a perfectly normal response to grief. During the pandemic, we know that many people's mental health began to suffer because we were isolated. We were afraid and we were unmoored from our regular rhythms and routines. There was so much loss all around us of life and livelihood, of normal things like school and work and visiting with loved ones. And by and large, we were doing what we were supposed to do. We were staying home, we were getting vaccinated, we were wearing masks, and yet the virus kept spreading, and so did the suffering. You see, even when we are doing all the right things, when we are being faithful, there can be circumstances beyond our control which cause us to feel grief and loss and, yes, depression. Which brings us to the story of Elijah. Now, Elijah is one of the greatest prophets in the Hebrew Bible, called during the reign of King Ahab of Judah to condemn the king's idol worship and to turn the people back to their covenant with God. Elijah was particularly critical of Ahab's Phoenician wife, Jezebel, blaming her for leading the people to worship the foreign god Baal. Elijah tells Ahab and Jezebel that the people of Israel are going to experience a severe drought and famine because of their worship of this foreign god. And just before this passage that Jason read for us, there's this great battle between Elijah and 400 of the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. In the end, the God Yahweh is triumphant through Elijah the prophet, and the prophets of Baal are killed. This brings an end to the drought, but also leads Jezebel to put out an edict on Elijah's life, that he will be killed. So despite his faithfulness to God, despite what we might even call success as a prophet, Elijah is now fleeing for his life. And so he runs as far away as he can go, into the wilderness, and then even farther beyond, until he is as far away as possible from his problems. And he's utterly alone. He finds a solitary tree in the middle of the desert, and he lies down under this tree, and he is ready to die. Elijah is alone, exhausted, afraid, and it seems deeply depressed. If we have never experienced depression ourselves, this might feel like it comes out of nowhere. At first, everything seems to be going great. Clearly, Elijah is doing God's work. He's following God's call on his life. And despite God's presence with him, Elijah feels deeply isolated. He has no longer any will to live. But it was here, in this moment, in this desolate place, physically and spiritually, that Elijah once again meets God. You see, God is not just with Elijah on top of Mount Carmel, or when he's outrunning Ahab's chariots. God is with him in the wilderness. God is with him under that solitary tree. God is with Elijah when he is alone and when he is in his deepest depression. It is there that God sends a messenger into the wilderness, and this part is important. The angel doesn't just tell Elijah to buck up, to get with the program and get over it. The angel doesn't say anything except get up, eat, drink. The messenger prepares a little cake and a jar of water and sits with Elijah while he eats and drinks and falls back asleep. He sits with him while he rests, and then he wakes him again. When he's ready, he says, Elijah, keep going. Keep going. This presence that was sent from God acknowledges that what Elijah has been called to do is very difficult. He says, you have a hard road ahead. Or as it says in the translation that we read this morning, this way is too much for you. Elijah can do this, but he can't do it alone. And so I wonder if this reading from 1 Kings and this story of the prophet Elijah might help us to better understand those who experience depression. Might help us to better understand this for others and for ourselves. To have compassion for those who are suffering. Perhaps this story can show us how depression afflicts so many people, including those that we consider to be strong and successful, gifted and great. And perhaps we too can follow the example of God's messenger in this story, showing us how we might offer care and compassion to those in our families and our communities and in our church when they are suffering, to be with them, to offer them practical support like food and water and rest, and to be a presence with them so that they do not feel alone in their illness or their grief. This story of Elijah, I think, is also a helpful reminder to all of us that our holy belovedness and our sacred worth and our call from God is not dependent on our strength. It is not dependent on our productivity or our ability to power through difficult things. We are not letting God down when we experience depression. We do not disappoint God when we say we need to take a break. Depression and grief are not things that we must simply endure, but they are part of the human experience and places where we may find God's grace in new and profound ways. You know, when we think of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, we probably think of his powerful preaching, or his strength in the face of injustice, or his embodiment of the love of God that enabled him to stand in nonviolence, even in the most violent of situations. But we probably don't think about Dr. King's early battles with depression, or the fact that he attempted suicide. We may not even be aware that throughout his life, Dr. King struggled with depression. A depression that was at once utterly exhausting, but also gave him deep compassion. It was through his struggles with depression that Dr. King learned to see what mattered most in life and the lives of others around him. It was when he acknowledged his own dark night of the soul that he gained his clarity, helping him to understand the path that we all must take in order to reach the promised land. Dr. King saw that change would only come that we accepted when we accepted our strength in our weakness and our collective journey together, and when we acknowledged our need for each other. In the story of Elijah, God does not appear to the prophet in the wind or in the earthquake, but in the silence. That is where Elijah heard the still, small voice that called him to keep going. And at the end of his journey through the wilderness, God tells Elijah to go back through the desert of Damascus, from where he had come, and to anoint a new king, and to lift up another prophet, Elisha, who would follow him. You see, God needed Elijah, but the work did not depend on him alone, and it would continue even after he was gone. This week, I read something that the Reverend Adam Russell Taylor wrote in Sojourners magazine about his own struggle with depression caused by seasonal affective disorder. He writes that in this season of the year, this season which he calls the season of blah, that is where he finds his energy sapped and his passion dimmed. And yet, he writes, it's also the season of Lent right now, a liturgical season in the church when we get to acknowledge our human finitude and the strength of God that is found in human weakness. Russell writes, when I confront my own weakness and vulnerability, that is when I have the most intimate encounters with God. When I'm forced to lean more fully on God's grace and less on my own will. It's a pretty countercultural message in our power-hungry culture, even in social justice movements. When we organize and plan and work hard to build the beloved community, and yet our weaknesses make us grapple with the fact that we cannot do this work alone. We may not see the fruit of our struggles, the battles we are fighting to combat racism and sexism, to end poverty and to promote climate justice, to protect our democracy, and so much more. They are not simply our own. They are God's. They are God's. And we are connected. It is in our weakness that we find God's strength. It is in the wilderness where we meet God's provision. It is in the silence that we hear the still small voice saying, keep going. Thanks be to God.
Hear now the rest of the story from Kings with Elijah. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answered, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Then the word of the Lord said, "Go out, stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the wind, or the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. The Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away."
Beloved, our act of response this morning is an invitation, if you would like, to move about the sanctuary during this time, to reflect on these questions that are here in your order of worship, or to light a candle against the darkness of depression and grief, either your own or the world's. If you are with us on Zoom, you are also invited to light a candle or to take some time to reflect on these questions. Stefan is going to play for us while we take this time of reflection, and then we will close this time by singing together, "O Lord, hear my prayer."
We appreciate your gifts to support the ongoing ministry of Dumbarton United Methodist Church. So you may place your offerings in one of the offering boxes at the rear of the sanctuary. Also, your online gifts are also welcomed. You may use the QR code in your bulletin to go directly to the donation page, or you can go to www.dumbartonumc.org and click on the donate button at the top. This is a blessing for depression. When you wander in a vast wilderness, bone-tired from running from your life, may you find one solitary tree to shelter you. When you cry your eyes and heart out and finally say how alone you feel, may a messenger of God show up, saying, eat something, take a little nap. I can see this journey is too much for you. When the voices inside you and out trick you into believing you are unloved, unworthy, unwanted. May they be drowned out by God's sheer silence, into which that voice will finally speak. From lips both human and divine, God hears you. God sees you. You are not alone, and you are not done yet. At this time in our service, we light the peace candle as a symbol of our deep desire for peace in our society, in our country, and in our world. And at this time, it might be good to remember that when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace.